how taking those copperplate basics and eventually molding them into a modern script is really helpful for legibility. Hey, I'm Becca with the Happy Ever Crafter, and today I am joined by Younghae from Logos Calligraphy. Welcome, Younghae.
Hi.
And today Younghae is going to be going through what copperplate calligraphy is. I think that it's like a term that you hear all the time in the calligraphy world, and now that calligraphy is so popular on Instagram and social media, but some people don't actually know really what it fully means. So she's going to be doing a little lesson and showing us everything to do with copperplate and walking us through all of that. But before we get started, I want to mention, as always, if you're watching this within the first 24 hours that it goes live, make sure you leave a comment down below and you'll be entered to win some free brush pens. And yeah, I think we should just jump right in. So Younghae, for anybody who might not know who you are, can you give us a little rundown of who you are, where people can find you, what you do, and all that good stuff?
Sure. So I'm Younghae. I run Logos Calligraphy Design. I started it about 3 years ago, I would say, and I first picked up Copperplate Calligraphy about 4.5 years ago when I was in Florida. And ever since then, I just fell in love with just going back to the art of handwritten things. And I started my business just taking on a lot of weddings and things like that. But now I focus mainly on teaching and sharing this script that I love to people all over the world. So I'm just really thankful to be able to share, this particular session today. So thanks for having me.
So you started your business 3 years ago, but how long ago did you learn calligraphy, or was that only 3 years ago?
So that was in 2014. So that's 5 years ago. Yeah, 2014.
And how did you learn copperplate?
So I took a weekend workshop with an instructor, Kay Hannah, and she was living in, we were living in Florida at the time. And I was just in a season where I needed an outlet, a creative outlet. I was raising 2 young kids, and I just wanted some beautiful words on my wall and being able to just inspire and lift my spirit and have hope. And so I actually Google searched I didn't even know copperplate back then. I just said any calligraphy classes in Orlando, and then the first link that popped up was a local art shop that was hosting this copperplate weekend. And so I was like, what is copperplate? But then the ad had this beautiful written script that was all flourished. And so I think from that moment, I was asking my husband, okay, you need to watch the kids. I really want to take this class. So that's kind of just how it started. And then once I took the class, I was just so captivated by the whole structure and the whole what you can do with it, how people turn it into business or create things for other people. So it's just such a blessing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sounds like a sort of similar story where I took a workshop and just got absolutely hooked and obsessed with it, and ever since then it's just kind of in history. It feels like you got amazingly good at it in the past couple of years too. I feel like copperplate is something that would take so much practice and is just so precise. I am just not a precise person, and trying to do that accurate kind of calligraphy is just not in my wheelhouse, at least yet. I tried it, but it's just haven't sat down to practice it. So I know that you're going to walk us through kind of what copperplate calligraphy is and show us all of your tools and stuff. So maybe if you want to flip your camera over onto your hands, and I can get my face off here and we can get into all of that stuff.
Okay, sounds good. So copperplate calligraphy is a traditional script, and it's derived from a form of handwriting called the English roundhand. And so I usually tell my students that it's a form of a shaded script that we use today, usually with an oblique pen holder like this. So it has a flange on the left side, and then this nib is a pointed, flexible steel nib. And so depending on the amount of pressure that you exert onto the nib, you can see hopefully through here that the tines separate and then it comes together. And so usually when we go down for the strokes, it will cause the tines to open, which causes a thickness. And then once you go back up, the tines will come back together so that it will create the nice hairlines. And so this is just an example of a copperplate written envelope. A lot of times calligraphers are hired to do copperplate script for wedding envelopes or invitation designs and things like that. And so earlier in my career, I did take on some envelope commission work. And so this is more of this is like a flourished version of copperplate script. But as you can see, some of the basic rules for copperplate still apply. So what those rules are maintaining the same baseline, consistent slants for the letters. You notice that every downstroke has a shade and every upstroke has a hairline. And it's written with a pointed flexible seal nib. And so with copperplate, it's very, very rule-based and very structured. And so I personally like teaching copperplate because it's very transferable and it's easy for me to share the concepts so that the students can understand it and actually be able to practice it right away. And so this is just a sheet from one of my pages that I hand out to my in-person workshops as well as my online classes. But this is generally for copperplate, you have these guidelines. So you have your X height, which is takes up the body of your letter. And then you have your baseline, which is the bottom here, the waistline. You have your first, second ascender line, as well as your first and second descender line. And then you always have to keep in mind of the slant. And the slant is really important because copperplate is based on a generally speaking 55-degree slant line. And so you can anywhere between, I would say, like 50 to 50 is okay, like 45 to 60. If you do a little bit difference, it's fine. But when I teach the class, we usually go off the 55-degree slant. And so this, I feel like, is where a lot of students have a hard time actually maintaining the slant, because a lot of us have handwritings where some handwritings are very like upright and some natural handwritings are very slanted. And so to be able to force our muscles to write at this 55-degree slant can be really difficult for some people. But over time, as you keep on practicing along this slant, I always tell my students that you will see that your muscle memory will develop, usually within like 3 to 6 months if you're putting in consistent practice. But the main things for copperplate that I look for when I can determine if a script is copperplate versus another script would be that it has a consistent shade on every downstroke, and all of that slant will be on that 55-degree slant. And then when you write the letters, it's very, there's a lot of pen lifts. And so just for an example, I have, let me show you guys a page of my exemplars for my letters. So for lowercase letters, this is just zoom out here. Okay, so if you notice here from A to Z, I have all these like instructional like numbers written out here. So for letter A, when you're doing your regular handwriting or even like modern calligraphy, you can just probably do it in one stroke. You can just write your A's, but then with copperplate, it's actually broken up into 3 strokes. And so when I'm teaching copperplate, we focus a lot on the basic strokes because those basic strokes are foundational to forming each of your letters. And so with letters like B, you have 1 and then 2 for the loop, come back up, and then 3 here. And then with letters like H, everything is all numbered, and it's not just one stroke that you write when you're doing cursive, for instance, but with copperplate, everything is broken down. So after every stroke, you have to lift your pen. And so that's the main difference between, I would say, like a handwriting versus cursive. And even with like different traditional scripts like Spencerian is more, I feel like more towards like, your natural cursive writing because there's not as many pen lips, but with Copperplate, every basic stroke has a pen lip. So that would be huge when I'm looking at like someone writing Copperplate, if I feel like, you know, they're doing Copperplate versus their own modern or Spencerian or cursive. So those are the main things for the Copperplate script. But just to give you guys an example of some of the basic strokes for Copperplate, I have these traceable sheets. So usually we begin with the entrance and exit stroke, and then there's about 7 basic strokes that make up the Copperplate lowercase letters. And so I have the demo up here with some descriptive words, as well as just a whole sheet of just how you can practice your basic strokes. So usually with the basic strokes for lowercase letters, you have your entrance exit stroke, and then you have your overturn strokes, and you have your underturn strokes, you have your compound curve stroke, your oval stroke, your ascending stem loop stroke, as well as, and then lastly, you have your descending stem loops. So let me see if I can grab a piece of paper and then show you guys, if I were to write out on this guide sheet here. Okay, so right now I'm going to be using my oblique pen holder. And this one, I'm a left-handed calligrapher, and you can use both a straight or an oblique, but for me, I actually switched from a straight holder. Straight holders look more like this, where it just looks like your nib can just go right into the straight holder. The oblique holder actually helps you to stay on slant, which has been very helpful for me. And even as a lefty, I use a right oblique holder. I just turn my paper about 90 degrees to the right so that I don't, I don't run into smearing, and I can still see my letters really clearly. So I'm going to be demonstrating with using this oblique pen. And then I have my ink in like these dinky dips, and this one is a Moon Palace Sumi ink. It's like my go-to black ink that I use not only for practice, but also when you're doing like digitizing your work, or when you're doing like commission work as well. This is a really great ink that scans well. And so usually I keep my inks in like a dropper bottle because these dinky dips are a lot smaller. So every time they run low, I would just fill it up with the ink. And then if I feel like my ink is getting too thick, then I also have another dropper bottle filled with distilled water. And so these are kind of like just the 2 dropper bottles I have on my desk at all times. And so if I feel like the ink is not running smoothly from my nib, I will just drop 1 or 2 drops of water in there just to like dilute it a little bit so that it flows well. So always make sure that your nib is being prepped well. And so usually when you buy it from the manufacturer, it comes like coated with a protective coating to prevent it from rusting. And so sometimes I honestly use my spit, or I'll take a potato and I'll stick it in there just to, we call it prepping the nib. And what that does is that it removes all of this protective coating so that the ink, once you dip it, this will be, ideally, it should stay on pretty well on top as well as the bottom. So that's going to prevent it from like blobbing or creating a lot of ink blobs. So going back to the sheet. So if I were to write the word copper, so making sure that the nib is always parallel to that slant line. So just in case it's a hard time, okay, I'll just draw this in. So here is that 55-degree slant, and then your nib should be always parallel. So a lot of times I see people doing Copperplate, but they're holding their nibs wrong, because I see their nibs going more upright like this. But then once you do that and you're trying to drag it along the slant line, it's actually going to affect your nib, the quality of your nib, because it might wear one tine over the other tine. And so I always make sure that when I'm looking down at my paper, that my nib is parallel, and the angle of my nib to the paper is about 45. So you don't want to be too upright like this, because then you're going to have a lot of like splatter, and like you're going to drag the ink. It's going to catch on the fiber of the paper, but then you don't want it too low. A lot of times I see students holding it really low, so then they won't see the thick and the thin differences. And so I always tell students to start at about 45 degrees and then adjust it a little bit accordingly, depending on what feels comfortable for your hand. And what I'm wearing on my hand is actually, I'm wearing, I don't know if you can see it, this thing right here is my husband's sock. And so we always like call this like a guard. And so I just, like, this is literally a sock. So he just found one of his mismatched socks, and then you just cut the top off here and you create like a hole for your thumb. And then the reason why I always practice with the guard is because I just don't want any of my oils on my hands to get on the paper. And so that's a good habit to get into as well. Just because when you're working on like really expensive paper, you don't want your oils to affect how your paint or your ink is going to react to that paper. So that's just a good habit to start on. Okay, so moving on to this.
And Young Hey, you said that these guides are available on your website, right? These guide sheets?
Mm-hmm. So if you go to logoscalligraphy.com/resources, I actually have a full section on like free downloadable guide sheets. So they can do the lowercase as well as uppercase. And then I actually just made a guide sheet for just practicing numbers. So there should be about 3 guide sheets available on my website.
Awesome.
Okay. So here I'm going to write copper. So sometimes after you dip it into the ink, you're going to want to make a little scribble just to make sure the ink is flowing. Okay. Then you have, I'm just going to write copper. You have your entrance stroke. You lift your pen. I'm just dramatically lifting my pen just to show you guys how many pen lifts there are. So sometimes like if you run out of ink, that's gonna happen where you have like a white space here, and that's fine. You just go back in and you can fill it in with ink. So notice that every time I'm going down, there's a shade, there's a pressure that I'm exerting onto the nib. And I'm making sure that I'm staying on slant. So here's copper. I have to go back here and finish the C. Okay. So this is an example of basic copper plate. And so you'll notice that the things that I look for when I'm looking at after I write is like, I just want to make sure I have consistent slant throughout, that all of my letters are like, so this shade on the R should be on slant. I'm looking at my spacing in between each letter to make sure it's pretty evenly spaced out. This oval shape, Copperplate is based on a lot of the oval shapes, so that's also something to keep in mind. And then I'm making sure that all of my letter forms are on the right line. So first ascender line, first descender line. So for that P, just making sure I'm right on that line. But with Copperplate, let's say this is a very rigid Copperplate. I'm going to just kind of show you a progression of what it looks like when you kind of tweak the script just a little bit. So let me move this over, and then, so even though Copperplate is very rigid, the thing I do love about it is because you can make certain tweaks and variations of the letter, and I would still consider that Copperplate because it's not veering too far away from the rules. So let's say the entrance stroke, you want to sure my ink is flowing again. Okay, let's say you want to begin with a little bit of a curved entrance stroke. So you notice that I'm still lifting my pen for each of the letters. I'm still trying to maintain the same slant. All of my letters are still on that baseline. And I'm just adding a little bit of a flourish. So just to show you guys here, I can add a little flick on that C. So this is more of like a variation, I guess, a little bit trying to add variation from this rigid copper plate, but this, I still feel like is copper plate, except it's a flourished copper plate because we're just adding a little bit of an extension from the P. We're not being so rigid with having a full pressure stroke for that P. And then, but the thing is that I'm still staying on the same slant. The baseline is still even all throughout the word. The spacing as well as every single downstroke has a shade, is a shaded stroke. So what if we were to talk about, okay, well, let's modernize the script? Because a lot of students ask me, well, do you teach modern calligraphy? And honestly, I've never taught a modern calligraphy class because I feel like knowing the foundations for copperplate is very helpful to actually learning modern calligraphy as well. So when we talk about modern calligraphy, we can actually, let me just try to demo this. So let's say we play around with the baseline for modern. So I'm still going to stay on the same slant, but you'll notice a couple of differences. Okay, so this is an example, I guess, when we were to talk about modernizing your script. When you were watching me writing this M, I actually did not lift my pen when we were doing this M. And you notice that the second here, the first stroke was shaded, but when I went to the second one right here, this stroke is not shaded. I just went right into that last stroke for that M. And then let me do that. Let's go to my pink pen. So this would be an example. So this part right here. Then I'm going below the baseline here and not sticking to the X height for this O. For this D, I'm not connecting the D to the E here. And then and you can just play around with kind of making your letters look a little more romantic or playful, or making some letters smaller than other letters. But I would say that the main thing I look for when I see beautiful modern script is legibility. So, with calligraphy, because the main purpose of calligraphy is to write beautiful words, if it's not legible, I feel like it takes away from even the beauty of it, unless you're doing more of like an abstract calligraphy art where you're just using letters to form a design not really meant for legibility, but just for a design. I think that's totally fine. But when you're writing a script where you want people to read the meaning and the words behind it, I do place a lot of value on legibility. So, for example, I guess if we were to, because sometimes I feel like when we write the letter A, and people are trying to be very bouncy with their letter A's, they can bring it way below their baseline. This is an example. So for me, this looks a little confusing. So this, maybe the person meant to write age, but this could be maybe a Q, or it could just, how it could easily be mistaken for other letters. And so with modern calligraphy, I think it's important to make sure when you read your letters that you won't have any confusion. I think one example I do remember from a challenge was somebody was trying to write wine, and then the W looked like a V, and then people were confused what it was saying. So that's just something to keep in mind. And so in this case, I would even say, you don't need to do it so much below the baseline. Maintaining the A letter form is more important than trying to create a lot of bounce in these letters. So those are just some ways that you can still maintain the copper. So here we have, again, the Copperplate, rigid Copperplate, the Flourish Copperplate. You can modernize it by kind of gently playing around with the baseline, not too much, because you don't want to end up confusing people with what word you're trying to write. But another way to modernize script is instead of doing it on the 55-degree slant, you can actually do a little bit more of an upright script. And so I guess I'll just show you guys one more example. So as a calligrapher, because we're trying to, fill our toolbox with many different scripts and styles that we want to offer to our clients, I do find it valuable to practice different kinds of lettering and different kinds of calligraphy styles, because you might have clients that might not want a rigid copper plate or even Copperplate at all. And so in order to offer your services to a more variety of clients, you will want to have a good portfolio of the different kind of scripts that you're able to do. So if I were to do more of an upright script, again, then my nib, you notice, not based on that 55, but if I do more like a 90-degree, you can just go. Okay, so this would be more of a upright script where if you want to do more of an edgy kind of look, you see how when I do my exit stroke here, I just did a slash to go back up. You can keep your D more square top. And then this here, you see how all of that slant is a little more upright compared to this Copperplate script, which is on a 55-degree slant. And so you can play around with either making these letters really tight, or you can even do it more spaced out. So spacing would be also a really good way to kind of change up your script, the look of your script. So let's try that. Okay, so that's an example of just playing around with the spacing. And even when you're doing a lot of scripts where it's more spaced out, I try not to do such a drastic spacing where maybe like this spacing here is like a lot wider than between the O and the D. I still try to maintain a somewhat of an even spacing, even though it's a wider spacing, if that makes sense. So I guess if we were to zoom out and see, okay, so again, here we started with the basic copper plate. Again, very, very structured on the slant line, ovals, as well as looking at the spacing. Every pen lift has to be done after every stroke, and every downstroke needs to have a shade. Here we just kind of play around with still maintaining some of those rules, but breaking it a little bit with the flourishing, so it's more looser. And then here we talked about modernizing your script, where you can play around with disconnecting letters as well as playing with the baseline, and then also keeping in mind the challenges and the warnings about legibility here. And then these are just two other ways to play with styling your letters, would be more upright versus more spaced out letters. So hopefully this helps, just to kind of give you guys an overview of how you can take, even if you've only learned Copperplate, you can still use that as a foundation to play around with different styles and letters. So
I love the way that you explained moving from learning those basics all the way down to kind of modernizing it. And I feel like the way that you see a lot of people, and myself included, teaching calligraphy now in a more modern way are still based on the basic strokes that you learn in Copperplate. So for example, like I still teach all of those basic strokes, but I call it modern calligraphy because I don't force people, like people don't have to write on the 55-degree angle. If they prefer to write on a straighter angle or a more angled angle, then they can, but they're still learning those basic strokes and understanding to lift your pen in between. And I think that just learning those basics and applying them to a more modern script makes it like automatically more legible, if that makes sense. So like I feel like when I first started learning calligraphy, you saw a lot of people, and it was just starting to get really popular on social media. You see a lot of people who were just figuring out their own pretty handwriting style and applying like faux calligraphy and putting thicker lines on the downstrokes. But you could easily tell when someone hadn't learned those basic strokes and wasn't lifting their pen in between, because it was just like naturally less legible. So I love that you talked about how taking those Copperplate basics and eventually molding them into a modern script is really helpful for legibility. I totally agree with that. Yeah. So what are you, I mean, I know you have a Copperplate course, but it's not open all year round. It only opens every once in a while. So what are some of your favorite other Copperplate resources that people could learn with?
Well, actually, so if you, I think it's only available to my email subscribers, but all of these traceable sheets that I talked about for the lowercase, and then I have also another packet for the uppercase letters. These are all the basic strokes for lowercase and uppercase. You actually do get these for free if you, I think it's part of my email list, like welcome like list. And then I actually did make these Copperplate practice pads. And so this is for lowercase, and then this one will be for the uppercase letters. And so, and it's so funny how this even started, because once I started teaching workshops, I feel like I was able to understand my students more and what they struggled with. And so I found that like a lot of students actually learned faster when they were tracing my letters. And so they needed some sort of a guide, because that's how you train your muscle memory. And so what I did was, this is my version 2. So I actually launched these a couple years ago, but now I have all of that basic strokes in here as well, but then it goes through every single letter. So it's about 42 pages. And then I included all of these instructional arrows, as well as a description, and then a full page of traceables. And then, so these are all like perforated, so you can take it out or make copies of it at home. So you can preserve this book. So this one, I have it available on my shop if you guys are interested, or I have some retailers. Yeah, and then if you guys don't have any supplies and you want to start fresh for learning Copperplate, I put together like this kit. Oh, it's just a white box right here. But this kit is something that I wanted to make that would be giftable for your friends or anyone that wanted to learn Copperplate. So usually I kind of package it with a little slip of what's inside, and then it comes with my practice pads, as well as an envelope with my favorite nibs. And then let me just open it for you guys. And then inside, I actually give a pack of these dinky dips. And then I have like this bag where if you open it, you will have your own dropper bottle of ink, the Sumi ink that I was talking about, the Moon Palace Sumi ink. So that way you don't have to like guess and try to figure out what's like the best supplies to you. So hopefully that will be helpful for anybody who wants to start learning Copperplate or pointed pen script. And then it has this dual pen holder where you can actually use it for both straight and oblique. You just take out the flange, put in the nib, and then you can either put it in directly to make it a straight, or you can put it with the flange to make it an oblique. So this is really cool. So yeah.
It's like the ultimate kit, and it's beautiful at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are awesome. So where, like you said, on your shop, so where can people find that?
So they can just go to logoscalligraphy.com/shop. And then they'll see all of their products through my online shop.
Perfect. Awesome. And you casually mentioned at the beginning, before we got on here, that you would give a coupon code to people who wanted to buy those things. So, So what did you say it was going to be, Becca?
Becca 15.
Okay. Awesome. So I'll pop that up on the screen with the link to your shop. And yeah, thank you so much, Yong Hey, for coming on here and clarifying all of those Copperplate questions for us. I know that that word gets thrown around a lot on Instagram, but I think a lot of people get confused about what the actual rules with Copperplate are and how to get started with all of it. So I think it'll be really helpful for people.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.